Kangdae watched in absolute horror as the disheveled homeless woman, Martha, suddenly lunged forward and shoved his stroller with violent force. His infant son, white designer cashmere, pristine and perfect, tumbled forward into the concrete. The sound of the impact ricocheted through the bustling Seoul street like a gunshot. Terrified and furious, Kangdae's guards tackled the woman to the ground, their hands crushing her grease-stained olive drab jacket against the pavement. But within hours at the private security facility, the syndicate's tech specialist pulled up the enhanced CCTV footage and turned to him, pale as a ghost. "Boss, you need to see this," he whispered. "In 15 years of surveillance, I have never seen anything like this." What he revealed next left Kangdae speechless. Before you continue, remember to subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know how far our story is going. Martha hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when people noticed her, when she wore the same olive drab uniform that now hung in tatters on her frame, when her eyes were sharp with purpose instead of haunted by ghosts. There was a time when her hands were steady, when they didn't tremble with the weight of memories that refused to fade. There was a time when she could sleep through the night without screaming. That was before the war zone, before Kandahar, before the sniper's glint became a language she spoke fluently, before survival meant seeing things no one else could see, before she learned that the human brain could hold trauma the way a vessel holds water, endlessly, without ever reaching capacity. The medical discharge had come with paperwork, forms filled out by bureaucrats who had never seen what she had seen, diagnoses written in clinical language: severe PTSD, combat-related, severe anxiety disorder, difficulty with civilian reintegration, recommendations for ongoing psychiatric care, medication management, and supportive housing programs. Martha had filled out the applications. She had showed up to the VA appointments. She had tried to sleep in the small apartment the government allocated to her, in a neighborhood where the sirens at night sounded too much like the warning systems in the forward operating bases. She had tried to hold down jobs. 3 different positions over 18 months, all of them ending the same way. One backfire from a car and she was crawling under a desk, hands shaking so badly she couldn't type. One loud noise and she was screaming, hands moving to a weapon that was no longer there. The 3rd job had ended when she'd grabbed a supervisor by the collar, convinced in that moment of dissociative panic that he was a Taliban fighter reaching for an AK. It took 3 other employees to pull her off him. The police had been called. No charges were filed. The supervisor had understood, some small fragment of human decency recognizing trauma when he saw it, but the job was gone. After that, Martha had stopped trying. The apartment lease ended. She had no income to renew it. The VA paperwork was still sitting in a drawer somewhere, or maybe she'd thrown it away. At some point in the progression from housed to unhoused, the distinction stopped mattering. What mattered was finding places to sleep that didn't get raided by police. What mattered was staying alive on the streets of a city that had no place for broken soldiers. On this particular Tuesday morning, Martha sat on a concrete crate near the corner of Gangnam Street, watching the city wake up around her. The location had been chosen carefully, as all of her locations were chosen. The crate was positioned in the narrow gap between 2 buildings, invisible to the casual observer, unless they were specifically looking for a homeless person. The angle gave her a view of the entire corner, 3 directions of approach, 2 escape routes if the police decided to move her along. The building to her left had a fire escape that she could climb if necessary. The alley to her right led to a network of smaller streets where she'd learned the rhythms and the safe spots. She had learned to think like a soldier again, even though she was no longer in the military. The war never really ended for people like Martha. It just changed venues. A discarded newspaper lay at her feet, 3 days old, the headlines already irrelevant. A half-empty bottle of water sat beside her, the plastic already warming in the morning sun, the liquid inside beginning to taste faintly metallic. To the businessmen hurrying past in their pressed suits and polished shoes, their faces buried in phones and their minds already at their desks, she was white noise. Set dressing, a fixture of Seoul's underbelly that they had trained themselves not to see. The way you learn not to see the cracks in the sidewalk or the chewing gum stuck to the lamppost. But Martha saw everything. Her eyes moved constantly, a habit born in a war zone where stillness meant death and awareness meant survival. Her gaze swept from the rooflines to the street level, from the shadows between buildings to the reflections in storefront windows. She tracked every delivery truck, every motorcycle, every car that pulled up to the curb. Her head tilted toward every sound. The screech of brakes, the slam of a car door, the footsteps of someone walking too fast, the particular rhythm of military-style boots that she still recognized even after 7 years away from the service. Her hands trembled constantly now, a fine tremor that had become part of her baseline state. The tremor came not just from the PTSD but from malnutrition, from the way her body had learned to survive on less than it needed. Her knuckles were cracked and bleeding. Her fingernails were broken and discolored. But the tremor reminded her that she was still alive, still breathing, still capable of movement even if that movement was involuntary. The phantom weight of bandages she used to wrap around bleeding soldiers whose names she could no longer remember pressed down on her hands like a permanent burden. She had been a combat medic. She had held lives in her hands. She had watched some of them slip away despite everything she did, despite everything she tried, despite the desperate prayer to gods she didn't believe in while her fingers worked to stop the bleeding, to seal the wounds, to keep consciousness from fading. 14 soldiers she had personally saved in Kandahar. 14 lives that continued because she had been in the right place at the right moment with the right training. She had been decorated for it. Commendations had been placed in her file. She had been promoted, recommended for leadership roles, told that she had a future in military medicine. And then came the incident that the paperwork referred to only as the event. The attack on the patrol. The IED that had taken out the vehicle ahead of hers. The moment when the world had split open and Martha had run toward the carnage, medical bag in hand, and found that 4 of the 14 soldiers whose lives she had saved were now dying again. And this time she couldn't save them. The tremor in her hands started that day. It had never stopped. Her posture was low to the ground now. Her frame coiled like a spring despite the years of sleeping on concrete and surviving on whatever scraps the city discarded. Her spine had learned the shape of benches and cardboard boxes. Her shoulders had rounded inward in a posture of self-protection that was simultaneously a military stance, ready to move, ready to fight, ready to run. She wore 3 layers of oversized jackets, all of them stolen or salvaged. The outermost one was a faded olive-drab military fatigue jacket stained with the grime of 100 street corners, and marked with the insignia of a rank she no longer held. The jacket had been part of her old life from before. She had kept it even when everything else was stripped away, because it was the last tangible piece of who she used to be. Sometimes, in the moments before sleep came, she would pull the jacket tighter around herself and pretend that she was still in the barracks, that the sounds outside were base traffic rather than Seoul's nightlife, that tomorrow she would wake up to a purpose instead of another day of survival. Her hair was matted under a beanie pulled low over her forehead, the hat itself so old and stained that its original color was indecipherable. Her skin was weathered, creased by sun and wind, and the kind of exposure that came from living outside for years. The lines in her face made her look older than her actual age. She was only 34, but she looked 50. Her face told the story of Kandahar, of the moment the world broke, of 5 years trying to function in a civilian world that she no longer understood. And 5 years on the streets where the rules were different but no less brutal. But her eyes were different from the rest of her. They were sharp, piercing, alert in a way that didn't match the wreckage of her body. They belonged to someone who had seen combat, who had learned to read the environment like a book written in blood and light, who understood that the world was divided into threats and non-threats and the space in between where mistakes meant death. Her eyes belonged to a soldier, even if everything else about her belonged to the streets. The morning progressed. Martha sat perfectly still on her concrete crate, practicing the stillness that had kept her alive in the combat zones, and was keeping her alive on these streets. A delivery truck rumbled past, and her eyes tracked it automatically, noting the make, the color, the slight damage on the passenger side door that suggested a recent accident. A woman with a stroller walked by. Martha's gaze lingered for a moment on the child inside, assessing the age, the apparent health, the way the mother's hand rested on the stroller. For just a moment, Martha felt something unfamiliar pierce through the numbness. A twist of maternal longing. The ghost of the woman she might have been if the war hadn't taken that possibility away. She had been engaged once. A fellow medic named David, with kind eyes and hands that were even steadier than hers had been. They had talked about marrying after deployment, about having children, about building a life together that was far away from the military, somewhere quiet where they could heal. But David had been in the vehicle ahead of hers on the day of the IED. He had been one of the 4 soldiers whose names she still knew, whose faces she still saw in her nightmares, whose deaths she still couldn't prevent no matter how many times she rewrote the scenario in her mind. A man in a business suit talked loudly into his phone. Martha's jaw tightened. The sound triggered something in her nervous system, a spike of adrenaline that served no purpose in this context, but couldn't be suppressed. Her hands clenched and unclenched involuntarily. She focused on her breathing, on the technique her VA therapist had taught her before the therapy ended due to lack of funding. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Release the tension, Martha. Release it or it kills you. Her hands slowly unclenched. Her nervous system slowly downshifted from high alert. But the baseline never returned to 0. The baseline was always somewhere around 7 or 8 on the tension scale, with spikes launching her into 10 whenever a trigger presented itself. The morning sun climbed higher, moving across the sky in its eternal arc. Her water bottle grew warmer. She had learned to drink it anyway, had learned to ignore the taste of warming plastic and the faint chemical flavor that suggested the water had been exposed to too much heat. Around her, the city's rhythm continued, the relentless pulse of Seoul's streets, the endless stream of people with somewhere to be, somewhere to go, someone waiting for them at home. The business district hummed with purpose. Delivery people rushed from building to building. Street vendors set up their carts, preparing for the lunch rush. Martha had nowhere to be. No one was waiting for her. She had learned to find a kind of peace in that fact, or something that resembled peace if you didn't look too closely. Something that resembled peace if you didn't ask questions about the screams that woke her at 3 a.m. from nightmares she could never quite remember upon waking. If you didn't examine the way her body went rigid when a car backfired. If you didn't notice the tremor in her hands that never fully stopped, that had become as much a part of her as her heartbeat. Her eyes continued their sweep of the environment. Rooflines, windows, shadows, reflections, the angles of approach, the exit routes, the places where threat could originate. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance. But it was also the only thing keeping her alive. She had learned that much in Kandahar, and the streets had only reinforced the lesson. Waiting. Always waiting. Waiting for the moment when her vigilance might save someone's life. Waiting for a purpose that made sense. Waiting for the day when her hands would stop shaking long enough for her to rebuild something of the life she had lost. Not knowing that waiting was almost over. The black sedan pulled up to the corner at 10:47 a.m. with the authority of a predator that had never learned to move quietly, because it never needed to. The vehicle itself was a declaration. Power, wealth, untouchable status. It didn't require subtlety. Subtlety was for people who had to hide what they were. This car announced itself proudly, a statement in automotive form that certain people existed on a different level of society, that certain bloodlines carried weight that couldn't be measured in money alone. The license plate bore no numbers. Just a single character that meant something to the right people in Seoul. To the police officers who understood which cars to look away from. To the security personnel who recognized the symbol and straightened their posture involuntarily. To everyone else, it meant stay out of the way. The door opened with the kind of smooth, silent precision that came from German engineering and unlimited budgets. Kangdae emerged like a man stepping out of mythology, or perhaps stepping into it. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making people uncomfortable. Every step was measured, every gesture controlled. There was nothing wasted in his movement, nothing that suggested uncertainty or hesitation. He was a man who had learned that power wasn't something you asked for. It was something you took and held with an iron grip. Something you reinforce through every interaction, every look, every subtle calibration of your presence in space. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit that had cost more than Martha's entire life was worth, more than she would earn in 5 years of actual employment if such employment were available to her. The suit had been tailored by a craftsman in Milan who worked only for a select clientele, and the fit was so perfect it seemed to have been poured onto his frame like liquid steel. The seams disappeared into his body. The fabric moved with him as if it were an extension of his skin rather than a separate garment. Beneath the suit, a black silk shirt. No tie, because men who needed ties were men who needed to convince others they had power. Men who truly had power didn't need to convince anyone of anything. They simply existed, and the world reordered itself around them. His hair was slicked back with geometric precision, not a single strand out of place. The style suggested hours of grooming, but more than that, it suggested a man who had such complete control over his physical form that even his hair obeyed him. Around his ring finger on his left hand, a heavy gold band engraved with a coiled dragon ready to strike, the crest of the Iron Dragon Syndicate. The ring caught the light as he moved, flashing like a warning beacon. The Iron Dragon Syndicate didn't just conduct business in Seoul. They owned entire districts the way a man owns his heartbeat. Not thinking about it, not questioning it, simply existing with the understanding that the whole organism depended on this particular function. They controlled shipping routes and real estate. They had fingers in legitimate businesses and illegitimate enterprises. Police officers reported to them. Politicians knew their names and made accommodations. They were the kind of organization that didn't appear in official records, that conducted business in ways that civilians never encountered, that operated in the shadows and in the light simultaneously, because they had the power to occupy both spaces without consequence. Behind Kangdae, one of his guards pushed a $5,000 designer stroller. An exclusive Italian brand favored by the ultra-wealthy, pristine white cashmere upholstery, Italian leather handles, hand-stitched details that caught the light like a pearl in darkness. The stroller itself was a statement, a declaration that the child inside was not a regular child but a special child. A child whose bloodline entitled him to the finest things available. A child whose existence was marked from birth by privilege and protection. Inside the stroller, his son slept peacefully. The child was no more than 18 months old, small enough that the cashmere surrounding him seemed to swallow him whole. The infant wore white cashmere as well, a tiny mirror of untouchable luxury, wrapped in fabric that cost more than most people made in a month. The child's face was peaceful, innocent, unaware that his bloodline came with a target painted on his back, unaware that his existence as an heir made him a focal point for every rival organization that wanted to diminish Kangdae's power, unaware that in the world of organized crime, the children were always fair game. Kangdae had learned this fact when his son was born. He had learned that fatherhood in his world meant something different than it meant for ordinary men. It meant vulnerability. It meant a pressure point. It meant that something precious existed that could be threatened, and that no amount of money or guards or power could fully protect it from all possible harm. 7 guards surrounded Kangdae, maybe 8. Martha couldn't count them all from where she sat because they moved like a coordinated organism, never maintaining fixed positions, always shifting in a pattern that suggested training and experience, and the kind of professionalism that came from having killed before, and being willing to kill again. They wore dark suits and earpieces. They moved with the coordination of men who had trained together, who had bled for the same cause, who understood that their lives depended on their ability to read threats and respond faster than those threats could manifest. Their eyes scanned the crowd, the buildings, the roof lines to the left and right, the street level where threats should be. They were trained to spot obvious danger. The kind that announced itself, the kind that came with a warning, the kind that moved fast or moved with obvious intent. They were trained by the syndicate's security chief, a man named Cho who had military experience and understood threat assessment from a professional standpoint. But they were not trained to see Martha. They were not trained to see ghosts. Martha sat perfectly still on her concrete crate, just another piece of human refuse cluttering the sidewalk, just another broken person that Seoul had learned to step around. Her matted hair under the beanie made her invisible. Her layers of greasy olive drab made her blend into the urban landscape like camouflage designed for concrete and despair. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly, looking like the hands of someone who had given up a long time ago, someone whose will had been eroded by years of struggle. But her eyes never stopped moving. She watched Kangdae pass within 15 meters of her position. She watched the stroller, so white, so pristine, so impossibly clean in a city of dirt and exhaust and pollution. She watched the guards, counting them again, assessing their positioning, understanding the tactical formation they had organized themselves into. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 if you counted the driver who had stayed with the sedan. Their hands rested casually at their sides, not on weapons but close enough. Their bodies positioned in a pattern she recognized immediately from her military days. Tactical formation. Designed to protect the high-value target in the center. Designed to create a perimeter that was difficult to penetrate. Designed to respond to threat vectors from predictable angles. The baby in the white cashmere. That was the high-value target. That was what required the tactical formation, the careful spacing, the constant scanning of the environment. Everything else, Kangdae, the guards, the street itself, was secondary to the protection of the child. Martha understood this. She had been trained to understand hierarchies of importance, to understand what needed to be protected and at what cost. In the military, the chain of command was clear. In the syndicate, the hierarchy was just as clear but operated by different rules. Blood came first. Heirs came first. Everything else was expendable. Kangdae's face was a mask. Cold. Indifferent. The kind of expression that came from a man who had learned early that showing emotion was a liability, that feelings could be exploited, that the world responded only to the projection of absolute control. His eyes looked down at the crowd as he walked, at the ordinary people scurrying about their ordinary lives, at the street vendors and the delivery people and the homeless woman on the crate, and there was nothing in that gaze but contempt. He saw them but didn't see them. They existed in his field of vision the way background characters exist in a movie about someone else's life. To him they were background. Set dressing. Extras whose existence was incidental to the main narrative. They were the people who made the world function, but had no bearing on his world, which operated according to different rules and different laws and different consequences. He passed Martha's position without looking at her. None of them looked at her. She was invisible. She was a ghost. She was precisely what she had become in the 5 years since discharge. A woman that the world had agreed didn't really exist. A person that you could step over without guilt. A fixture that belonged to the urban landscape in the same way that potholes and graffiti belonged. And that invisibility, that perfect absolute invisibility, was the only thing that might save a life. The glint came from the 4th-story window across the street at exactly 10:47 and 23 seconds a.m. Martha's body went rigid. Not gradually. Not in stages. Not as a response that could be broken down into component parts and analyzed. In an instant, every muscle in her frame locked into absolute stillness. The tremor in her hands stopped. The constant micro-movements of her eyes that tracked the environment like a predator's ceased. The tiny adjustments of her posture that maintained readiness halted. She became a statue, carved from concrete and survival instinct, frozen in the moment of recognition. It wasn't a thought. Thoughts were too slow. In war zones, thinking got you killed. Thinking meant delay. Thinking meant analysis and consideration and the possibility that by the time your brain had caught up with the situation, the round had already been fired and was already traveling toward its target at 2,900 feet per second. Thinking was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford when their lives depended on instinct and reaction, and the muscle memory that had been trained into their bodies through endless repetition. What Martha felt was pure, unfiltered instinct. The glint of a scope at 4 p.m. angle, catching the 10:47 a.m. sun at precisely the right moment to flash like a mirror. A brief, brilliant reflection of light bouncing off curved glass. 1 frame, 2 frames, barely visible to the untrained eye. But to someone who had spent 7 years in Kandahar, who had trained her eyes to read the language of lethal geometry, who had learned to understand death in the microsecond before it arrived, it was as clear as a neon sign screaming danger. Her gaze locked on the window. 4th floor. The building next to the white apartment complex. Approximately 120 meters away. The angle was perfect for a sight line down the street. The sun was perfect for catching the scope's reflection. The window was dark enough to hide a shooter, light enough to catch the glint of precision optics as they moved through their arc. Tracking an arc. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Not from fear. Fear came later, came in the moment after the body had already committed to action. This was something else. This was the moment before fear, the moment of pure recognition, the moment when the body understands what the mind is still in the process of accepting. Someone was tracking a target across the street. A professional. Not an amateur who would get nervous and miss. Not someone with a hunting rifle who was unfamiliar with urban shooting. A professional with a military-grade scope and the training to use it. The scope was expensive. She could tell by the particular way the light caught it, by the lens quality, by the precision of the reflection. Military-grade. High-end civilian tactical. The kind of equipment that suggested significant resources, significant training, significant intent. The angle was measured and deliberate. Not a wild shot. Not someone testing their range. Someone who had already calculated the trajectory, who had already determined the distance, who had already set up the shot with the kind of preparation that professionals used. The way the scope caught the light meant the shooter was already in position, already had the target in their sights, already had their finger resting on the trigger, or preparing to rest it there. Already locked in, ready to fire, waiting for the moment when the target aligned with the crosshairs. Martha's eyes snapped to Kongdae, the man in the gray suit, the man who had passed her location without seeing her, just as he passed everything without truly seeing it. The man who was walking in a straight line toward the killing zone. The man whose black silk shirt was about to intersect with a high-velocity round traveling at lethal speed, toward the line where a high-velocity round would pass in seconds. And beside him, her gaze shifted to the stroller, the white cashmere. The baby inside, sleeping peacefully, innocent and unaware that someone across the street had already drawn a bead on the space it occupied, had already positioned the crosshairs, had already prepared to fire. Martha had saved 14 soldiers in Kandahar. 14 lives that continued because she had been in the right place at the right moment with the right training and the right instinct. She had been decorated for valor. She had received commendations for tactical awareness and split-second decision-making under fire. She had been told that she had the ability to see things that other people missed, to read situations with a clarity that bordered on precognition, to understand threat in ways that came from the deepest parts of the brain, the parts that had evolved to recognize danger before conscious thought could get in the way. But that was a lifetime ago, before the streets, before the concrete crate, before the tremor in her hands and the screams that woke her at 3 a.m., before she became someone that the world had agreed to stop seeing. That was before she became invisible. The glint moved. A fraction of an inch. The shooter was adjusting aim. The target was moving. The stroller was continuing its forward motion down the street. In another 2 seconds, the shot would be aligned. In another 3 seconds it would fire. In 2.3 seconds after that, a round traveling at approximately 2,900 feet per second would pass through the space where the stroller currently existed, where the baby currently rested, where Kongdae's bloodline currently continued breathing. Martha's coiled frame released like a spring snapping. There was no time for strategy, no time for planning, no time for consideration of consequences, no time for anything except the knowledge that in 2-3 seconds, death was coming, and the only thing standing between death and this child was a homeless woman sitting on a concrete crate who understood, with absolute certainty, that she was about to cross a line from which there was no return. She screamed. The sound came from somewhere deep in her chest, primal and raw, born in a throat that had spent years silent on the streets, in a body that had learned to make itself small and quiet and unnoticeable. But now it released, all of that silence and fear and broken purpose channeling into a single word. Get down. But screaming wasn't enough. Screaming gave warning but no protection. The guards would hear it, their training would make them react to a threat signal, but would they understand? Would they move fast enough? Would they position themselves correctly? Would they? No. There was no time for would. Martha was already moving. Her dirty hands, caked with street grime, scarred from years of sleeping on concrete, bearing the marks of a life lived in exposure and survival, slammed into the pristine white stroller with the force of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to save. The impact was violent. The stroller, designed for smooth motion on city streets, engineered for the comfort and safety of expensive infants, was never meant to withstand the full-body lunge of a 110-pound woman moving at maximum velocity. It tilted. For a moment that felt like an eternity but lasted only milliseconds. It hung suspended in the air, balanced between stability and chaos, between the trajectory it had been following and the new path that was being forced upon it. The baby inside, pristine white cashmere, innocent, untouched by the violence that had shaped his bloodline, unaware of the targeting system that was locked onto his position, began to cry as gravity took hold and destiny rewrote itself in real time. The stroller toppled forward, away from the sight line, away from the trajectory, away from the place where death was traveling on a path that had already been calculated and confirmed and was now, in that moment, rendered obsolete by the action of a woman whose instinct was faster than mathematics, whose understanding of threat was deeper than any calculation, whose willingness to act superseded every consideration of personal consequence. The sniper's round arrived exactly 2.3 seconds later. The high-velocity bullet struck the stroller's chrome frame with surgical precision. It struck at the exact point where the baby's head had been resting just a heartbeat before. The impact created a spark, a brief, violent flash of friction between metal and ballistic projectile traveling at lethal velocity. The sound was almost lost in the chaos, swallowed by the baby's wails and the screams of the crowd, and the confused shouts of 7 highly trained guards who suddenly found themselves in a situation their training had not prepared them for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 guards. They moved like a machine with a single purpose. Within 2 seconds, Martha was on the ground, her weathered face pressed against the concrete, her hands forced behind her back by forces beyond her control. 4 guards held her, their hands pressing down with enough force to break bones, with enough force to make it clear that resistance was futile and suffering was imminent. They were trained to suppress threats without mercy, to neutralize danger before danger had a chance to explain itself, to act first and ask questions later, to protect the high-value target above all other considerations. Martha didn't resist. She couldn't. Not because of the guards holding her down. She had spent 7 years in combat, had trained her entire adult life in ways to fight, knew how to survive against overwhelming odds, understood that resistance was always possible even when it was certain to fail. But because the sound of the sniper's bullet had triggered something in her that only understood one language now. The knowledge that she had just crossed a line from invisible to seen, from ghost to criminal, from a person that the world had agreed didn't exist to the primary focus of a man whose power was absolute, and whose mercy was non-existent. From savior to monster in the eyes of the man whose son had just been spared. Kangdae scooped his son from the overturned stroller with a movement that was both gentle and violent, with the care of a father and the fury of a predator. The baby was crying, screaming, terrified by the sudden chaos and the rough handling, and the world transforming from safety to terror in the space of a single second. Kangdae pulled the white cashmere bundle against his charcoal suit, cradling the child's head with one hand while his other hand moved to. But he stopped. His eyes locked onto Martha's face, and what they found there was not the face of an attacker, not the face of someone trying to harm his son. Martha's face, pressed against the concrete, was twisted not with rage or malice or the expression of someone executing a calculated assault, but with something else, something that looked almost like anguish. Her whole body was trembling. Not from the guards pressing her down, not from the pain of having her arms wrenched behind her back, but from the knowledge of what she had just done, what she had just revealed about herself by saving him, what price she would have to pay for allowing herself to be seen. For a moment Kangdae's mask slipped. For one instant his cold, indifferent expression fractured like glass struck by a hammer, not into compassion. He was not a man capable of compassion, not a man whose path through life had taught him that feeling deeply was anything but a liability, but into something more dangerous. Confusion. The confusion of a man whose worldview had just been challenged by reality, whose understanding of power and threat, and the way the world worked had just been disrupted by a moment that didn't fit into any of his frameworks. Then the mask snapped back into place with an audible click that was purely psychological, but felt real nonetheless. His face transformed. The confusion evaporated like water under heat. What replaced it was something far more terrifying than confusion. It was the rage of a father who believed someone had tried to harm his bloodline, combined with the wounded pride of a man who couldn't understand why he wasn't dead, combined with the confusion of someone whose perception of reality had been fundamentally altered in the space of seconds. The three emotions fused into something primal and lethal and absolutely unforgiving. His eyes, dark as obsidian, locked onto Martha's with the intensity of a sniper lining up a target, with the weight of absolute power meeting absolute vulnerability. "Get her up," he said. His voice was soft, controlled. The kind of voice that came from a man who had learned that volume was unnecessary when you had absolute power, that the quieter you spoke, the more people had to lean in to listen, the more your words seemed to carry weight that transcended mere sound. "Take her to the warehouse." The guards obeyed instantly. Their obedience was instant and absolute, the kind of obedience that came from years of understanding that Kangde's orders were not requests but commandments that transcended normal considerations of law or morality or consequence. Martha was yanked to her feet, her arms still twisted behind her back, her body still trembling from the PTSD episode that had been compounded by the trauma of sudden violence and sudden exposure. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She didn't plead or try to explain. She simply looked at Kangde as they dragged her toward the black sedan. And in that look was the understanding of what came next. The interrogation. The discovery of who had sent her. The extraction of information through whatever methods the Iron Dragon Syndicate found necessary. The breaking of her body and mind in ways that would make the streets look like sanctuary. And then the execution. Kangde held his son against his chest as they forced Martha into the car. The baby's cries continued, a soundtrack of fear and confusion and the knowledge that the world was not safe, that danger could appear from anywhere, that even surrounded by guards and power and resources, vulnerability was always possible. Around them, the crowd had dispersed. People had learned not to witness things the Iron Dragon Syndicate didn't want witnessed. The street, moments before filled with the rhythm of Seoul's morning, had become a ghost town of silence and fear. The street vendors had disappeared. The businessmen had changed their routes. The city itself seemed to hold its breath and turn away from what had transpired on this corner, at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Martha stared out through the car's window as they drove away, her matted hair falling across her face, her hands still trembling, her mind already preparing for what came next. She had been invisible for so long. Now she was seen, and that sight was going to cost her everything. But the baby was alive. And that, she thought with a clarity that only combat veterans understand, with the understanding that came from 7 years in Kandahar and 5 years on the streets, with the knowledge that sacrifice was sometimes the only currency that meant anything, that might be worth the price. The black sedan disappeared into the traffic of Seoul, carrying Martha toward a warehouse, toward interrogation, toward the collision of two worlds that should never have intersected but had, on a Tuesday morning, in a moment that would change everything. Toward her reckoning. Toward his awakening. Toward the moment when the most powerful man in Seoul would have to confront the truth that the invisible had seen what his elite guards could not. And that debt, in the world of organized crime, was the most dangerous currency of all. The warehouse where they took Martha was not like the ones in movies. There were no theatrical interrogation rooms with single overhead lights and metal tables designed for maximum psychological discomfort. The real machinery of the Iron Dragon Syndicate was far more mundane, and far more terrifying precisely because of that mundanity. The sedan pulled into the underground parking structure at 11:17 a.m. The structure was cool, dimly lit, the kind of place where sound seemed to disappear into the concrete and never return. Martha was hauled from the car by 4 guards whose faces she couldn't see, because they had learned not to show their faces to people they were about to hurt. Identities were liabilities in this world. Faces were weaknesses. Better to be a uniform, a function, an instrument of organizational will without the complication of individual identity. She was dragged down a corridor that seemed to go deeper than it should have, past doors that were sealed and marked with numbers rather than names. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to grate against the human nervous system. Her feet didn't touch the ground. The guards carried her between them, her arms twisted at angles that suggested imminent dislocation, but not quite reaching that point. Not yet. The pain was kept at a level that was tolerable, which in a strange way made it worse. Tolerable pain meant she would still be conscious to experience what came next. They threw her into a room. The room was small, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls that had been painted a shade of gray that seemed designed to crush hope. One metal table. 2 metal chairs. A single light fixture hanging from the ceiling like the eye of God watching everything, missing nothing, judging all. No windows. 1 door. No comfort. No dignity. Just the physical reality of confinement, and the knowledge that the world outside had already moved on, had already forgotten that she existed, and would continue to forget for as long as her absence was convenient. They left her wrists zip-tied to the chair. The plastic cut into her skin immediately, the edges sharp enough to draw blood but not sharp enough to be considered a weapon. Everything about this setup was designed with precision. Sufficient discomfort to establish dominance without crossing the line into visible injury. They would want her to look presentable enough for questioning. They would want her able to speak and think and answer questions with at least enough coherence that her answers could be evaluated for truth or deception. The light hummed. Martha closed her eyes, trying to find the stillness she had learned in the military, trying to access the mental state that allowed soldiers to survive interrogation through compartmentalization and denial. But her mind wouldn't cooperate. Her PTSD was responding to the confinement with a kind of panic that was pure and primal. Her breathing became shallow. Her heart rate spiked. Her body was convinced it was back in the forward operating base, back in the moment before the IED went off, back in the moment before David died. She forced herself to breathe. For counts in. Hold for 4. For counts out. Release the tension or it kills you. The mantra she had learned from a VA therapist who had run out of patients or funding or both. The mantra that kept her functional on the streets, kept her from completely shattering when the nightmares came at 3 a.m., and the world seemed determined to remind her that she should be dead instead of David. But breathing wasn't going to save her now. In the sedan, riding back toward headquarters with his son finally sleeping, exhausted by the trauma of the morning, Kongdae's mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface level was handling the logistics of power, assigning guards to watch the warehouse, calling his security chief to brief him on what had happened, making the necessary phone calls to ensure that certain people understood that whatever had occurred on that street corner was not to be discussed with authorities or media or anyone outside the organization. But underneath that, in the depths where he kept the parts of himself that no one else was allowed to see, something was troubling him. The image of Martha's face, pressed against the concrete. The way her whole body had been trembling. Not with rage or malice or the expression of someone executing a calculated assassination attempt, but with something else. Something that looked almost like anguish, like the expression of someone who had just given up her invisibility for something that might matter more. It made no sense. An assassin didn't assault a target with their bare hands. An assassin didn't scream a warning. An assassin didn't act with the kind of desperation that suggested they were trying to save something rather than destroy something. But he had given the order. The guards had executed it. Martha was now in the warehouse, and soon enough, they would extract the information they needed to understand what had happened and who had sent her. The interrogation would be thorough. The interrogation would be painful. The interrogation would last as long as it needed to last. And when they were finished with the interrogation, Martha would cease to exist. This was the way power worked. This was the way the Iron Dragon Syndicate maintained control. Threats were identified and eliminated. Loose ends were tied up. Complications were resolved. But something about the resolution of this particular complication was making him uncomfortable. In the warehouse room, Martha waited. She didn't know how long she waited. Time became elastic in spaces like this. Minutes stretched into hours or collapsed into seconds. Her sense of temporal progression was compromised by pain and fear, and the constant low-level humming of the fluorescent light that seemed designed to wear down her will 1 hertz at a time. She thought about the baby, the child in the white cashmere, sleeping peacefully in the stroller before everything changed. She thought about whether the child had been hurt, whether the sound of the gunshot had traumatized him, whether he would grow up understanding that his existence had been protected by a woman whose name he would never know, whose face he would never remember, whose sacrifice would be completely invisible to him. She thought about the moment when her hands had made contact with the stroller. The moment when she had moved from invisible to seen, from ghost to criminal, from a person that the world had agreed didn't exist to the primary focus of one of the most dangerous men in Seoul. She thought about David, about the moment when she realized that the round had hit him, that the blood pooling around his body was too much, that her hands and her training and her desperate prayer to gods she didn't believe in were not going to be enough to stop death from claiming him. She thought about how she had held him while he died, her hands trying to maintain pressure on a wound that was too catastrophic for pressure to matter. She had been saving lives. And then she had failed to save the one life that mattered most. And now, 7 years later, she had stepped out of her invisibility to try to save a different life. A stranger's life. A child who would never know her name, whose father probably believed she was attempting assassination, whose existence she had protected with an action that had cost her everything. The door opened at 2:34 p.m. Kang Dae entered the room, and the first thing Martha noticed was that he was not what she expected. She had expected rage. She had expected violence. She had expected the expression of absolute fury that came from a man whose power had been challenged, whose son had been threatened, whose worldview had been disrupted. What she got instead was something far more complicated. His face was composed. His expression was controlled. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes looked at her with confusion, with something that might have been suspicion, but also might have been doubt. He pulled out the metal chair across from her and sat down slowly, deliberately. Every movement was measured. Everything about him suggested a man who had complete control over his body, and therefore complete control over the situation. Who sent you? His voice was soft, controlled. The kind of voice that made her understand that volume was irrelevant when you had absolute power. Martha said nothing. She had learned in Kandahar that silence was a weapon. Information was currency, and the first person to spend it was the person who lost the negotiation. Her hands trembled in her lap where they were bound. Her breathing remained shallow, but her mouth remained closed. Look at me. Not a request. An order delivered with the kind of authority that suggested it would be obeyed, or there would be consequences. Martha raised her eyes. They met his, and for a moment, there was nothing between them but the understanding of two people who understood violence in ways that civilians never could. His violence had been chosen and cultivated and weaponized into a tool of organizational control. Her violence had been born in a war zone and had never fully left her, had migrated instead from kinetic to psychological, from external to internal. Who sent you? Each word was separated by a pause. Each word landed like a hammer blow. No one sent me, Martha said. Her voice came out as a rasp, damaged by years of disuse, strained by the tremor running through her entire body. But there was something in that rasp that suggested honesty, something that suggested she was not lying. Kang Dae's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his elbows on the metal table. The table was old, scarred by years of use, marked by things that might have been blood or might have been rust or might have been both. You threw my son into the street. You attacked my bloodline. You crossed a line that only the bravest or the most foolish would cross. So I will ask again. Who sent you? No one. Clearer this time. Still shaking. Still damaged. But clearer. More certain. The kind of clarity that came from someone speaking truth, rather than spinning deception. My guards saw you. They watched you lunge at the stroller. They watched you attack the child of the man who can make you disappear without a trace. They watched you assault the future of the Iron Dragon Syndicate. His voice remained soft, but there was something underneath it now. Something that suggested violence was not far away. That her next words would determine whether she lived through this room, or left it in pieces. I didn't attack your child. The words came out with the weight of absolute conviction. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kangdae's jaw tightened. For a moment, Martha thought he was going to reach across the table and end this himself. With his own hands, with the kind of violence that didn't require questions or answers, with the kind of solution that organized crime employed when dialogue proved insufficient. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked toward the door. The movement was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Something that suggested his certainty had been damaged, that his worldview had encountered something that didn't fit into any of his frameworks. Keep her here, he said to the guards waiting in the corridor. And if she tries to explain again, let her know that words are only currency if they come with answers. The door slammed shut. Martha was alone again with the hum of the fluorescent light, and the tremor in her hands that had nowhere to go. But something had changed in that interrogation. Something in Kangdae's certainty had fractured. Kangdae's tech specialist was named Park. He had been with the syndicate for 15 years, handling the digital infrastructure that kept the Iron Dragon syndicate connected, informed, and ahead of threats. Park was 38 years old, had a wife and 2 children, and understood that the price of his employment was discretion and competence, and the willingness to never ask questions about what he discovered in the feeds and footage he accessed. He was sitting in his office on the 42nd floor of the headquarters building when Kangdae's personal assistant found him and dragged him downstairs without explanation. No one received unsummoned summons from Kangdae. No one was called to his presence unless something had gone wrong or something required urgent attention. Park's mind was running through scenarios as he was escorted downward. Budget shortages, security breaches, some minor infraction that was about to become a major problem. They went to the conference room. The one with the glass walls and the view of Seoul spreading out below like a map of power and territory. Like a civilization that belonged to Kangdae and anyone else with the resources and will to take what they wanted. Kangdae was already there, standing at the window, looking down at the city like a man surveying his kingdom. Like a man whose power was so absolute that the people below him might as well have been insects. But there was something about his posture that suggested tension. Something that suggested something had disrupted the normal flow of his day, had introduced a variable that he couldn't quite account for. The street corner where my son was attacked, Kangdae said without turning around. Every camera, every angle. I want the footage from every security camera within a 3-block radius. And I want it now. Park moved fast. He had learned years ago that efficiency was the only currency that mattered in moments like this. Hesitation could be interpreted as incompetence or disloyalty, and neither of those conditions were conducive to continued employment or continued life. He pulled out a tablet and started accessing feeds. The jewelry store across the street from where the incident had occurred had good coverage. High-resolution cameras positioned at multiple angles specifically designed to catch shoplifters and organized crime activity. The apartment building next to it had security cameras on every entrance. The street-level traffic camera had captured the entire incident from multiple angles. Park's fingers flew across the tablet screen. He pulled up feeds, synchronized timestamps, isolated the frame where Martha pushed the stroller. He was looking for something specific, a hand, a weapon, evidence that would confirm what Kangdae already believed. That Martha had been sent to hurt the child. That this was a coordinated attack from a rival syndicate. That the assault was premeditated and planned and deserving of the kind of violent response that would send a message to anyone foolish enough to threaten the Iron Dragon Syndicate's bloodline. That's when he saw it. The metal sparkle. The bright flash of something hitting the stroller's chrome frame. Not from Martha's hands. Not from anything Martha was carrying. From above. From outside the normal frame of reference. From somewhere that was tracking across the stroller's position on a trajectory that made no sense unless. Park's blood went cold. He had served in the military before joining the syndicate. He knew what a ballistic impact looked like. He knew the signature of a bullet striking metal at high velocity. He knew that the spark he was seeing on the screen was not from Martha. It was from a sniper round. A professional sniper round. A round that had been fired from somewhere across the street. That had impacted the stroller at precisely the moment when Martha's hands had made contact with it. The implications of that observation cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling in slow motion. If the round had impacted the stroller, and if Martha's hands had been pushing the stroller away from its original trajectory, then Martha's push had moved the stroller out of the path of something that had been tracking it. Martha hadn't assaulted the child. Martha had saved the child. From a sniper round. From a professional assassin. From a coordinated hit that Kangdae himself probably didn't even know was in progress. Park's hands started shaking. He had just realized that his boss had ordered the execution of the woman who had saved his son's life. "Boss," Park said, his voice shaking slightly. "You need to see the footage from the jeweler's security camera." Kangdae turned from the window. For the first time since Martha had pushed the stroller, something changed in his expression. Not fear. A man like Kangdae didn't feel fear. But something close to it. The recognition that the world was not arranged the way he had believed it to be, that the incident on the street corner was not what he had thought it was, that the woman he had ordered taken to the warehouse and interrogated and eventually executed was not guilty of what he had accused her of. "Show me." They watched the footage 7 times. The first time, Park played it at normal speed. The footage showed the arrival of the black sedan. The emergence of Kangdae with his guards in perfect tactical formation. The appearance of the stroller, pristine white, pushing forward down the sidewalk. The city around them moving at its normal pace, unaware that a professional sniper was tracking a target, unaware that death was traveling through the air at lethal velocity, unaware that the next few seconds would change everything. They saw Martha lunge. They saw the impact. They saw the guards swarm. They saw the immediate aftermath, the confusion, the shouting, the rapid response of trained professionals encountering something they didn't understand. "Again," Kangdae said. "Slow." The second time, Park slowed it to half speed. They could see more detail, the way Martha's body moved, the angle of her arms, the force behind her push. They could see the stroller tilting, responding to the force of her hands. They could see the guards beginning their response, beginning to understand that some kind of threat had materialized. But it was still difficult to see what had happened to the stroller itself, difficult to see the round that had impacted the chrome handle, difficult to see the moment when death had passed through the space where the child had been resting. Again. Frame by frame. Show me the stroller from the moment before the push until 3 frames after. Park's fingers moved across the tablet. The footage slowed to a crawl. 1 frame per second. The movement became mechanical, divorced from the fluidity of real time, broken down into component parts that could be analyzed and understood and accepted. 1 frame. The stroller is in motion, pushing forward down the sidewalk. The baby inside is sleeping. The chrome handle is unblemished. 1 frame. A bright point of light appears on the chrome handle. A spark. A glint. The impact signature of a high-velocity projectile striking metal. The signature of death passing through the space where the child is resting. 1 frame. Martha's hands make contact with the stroller. Her body is already in motion, already committed to changing the trajectory of the device, already moving with the kind of urgency that suggested absolute certainty about what was happening. 1 frame. The stroller is tilting forward, pushed by Martha's hands. The stroller has moved approximately 18 inches from its original trajectory. The space where the child's head had been resting just milliseconds before is now occupied by empty air. 1 frame. Another spark appears in the space where the stroller had been. In the space where the child's head had been. In the space where the round is traveling without obstruction, continuing on its arc, passing through the environment where nothing important remains for it to hit. Kangdae stopped breathing. Not in the dramatic sense. In the clinical sense. His breathing actually ceased for approximately 4 seconds as his brain processed the information his eyes were delivering. The stroller had been hit. By a bullet. A sniper's bullet. Traveling at lethal velocity. Aimed at. He couldn't tell from the footage whether the round had been intended for him or for the child. He couldn't determine the angle with absolute precision, couldn't isolate the point of origin, couldn't definitively establish the shooter's original intent. But the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere across the street, someone had fired a round. A professional round, by the look of it. around that suggested training, resources, organization, intent. And Martha, a homeless woman sitting on a concrete crate, had seen it coming in time to push the stroller out of the path. She had seen the glint of the scope. She had recognized the threat. She had acted with the kind of split-second decisiveness that separated the living from the dead. She had pushed the stroller away from trajectory, and in doing so, she had moved Kangdae's son out of the path of a bullet that would have killed him. "Boss." Park was staring at him, waiting for a reaction. "Boss, should I contact the police? Should we?" But Kangdae was already moving. He was already walking toward the door. He was already understanding, with the clarity that came from seeing the truth frame by frame, with the comprehension that emerged from understanding that he had been wrong, that his perception of the incident had been fundamentally flawed, that the woman he had ordered taken to the warehouse was not guilty of attempted assassination, but guilty only of the sin of being visible at exactly the moment when visibility mattered more than invisibility. He was walking toward the warehouse. The warehouse was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light. Martha had stopped shaking at some point during the hours of waiting. Either the PTSD episode had run its course, or she had simply given up on the possibility of control. She sat in the metal chair with her wrists still bound by zip ties, her eyes staring at the concrete table in front of her, her mind moving through the scenarios that were coming next. Interrogation. Pain. Death. The normal progression of consequences for someone who had crossed Kangdae. She had made peace with that outcome. She had accepted that saving the child had cost her life. The trade seemed fair to her. One invisible life in exchange for a child's future, for a legacy that would continue because a homeless woman had seen something that no one else could see. The door opened. She expected Kangdae with a weapon. She expected guards with devices designed to extract information through agony. She expected, with the clarity that came from her military experience, the machinery of an execution being set into motion, the kind of machinery that operated with precision and efficiency, and the understanding that loose ends needed to be tied up before they could become complications. What she got was something else entirely. Kangdae stood in the doorway, and he was holding a coat, not a weapon. A long, dark overcoat designed for Seoul's winter, for the kind of cold that penetrated to the bone, for the kind of exposure that could kill if you weren't protected. Behind him, guards moved into the room and cut the zip ties from her wrists without a word. The plastic fell away like chains breaking. Blood rushed back into her hands, and the sensation made her gasp, not from pain, but from the sudden understanding that this was not what execution looked like. Kangdae stepped forward. He held out the coat. Martha stared at it. Her mind, trained to read threats and opportunities, was struggling to interpret what this gesture meant. In the language of violence she had spoken for most of her adult life, a coat meant protection. It meant someone was acknowledging your existence enough to ensure you wouldn't freeze. It meant warmth. It meant consideration. It meant something that she had stopped expecting a long time ago. "Put it on," Kangdae said. Martha took the coat with hands that were still trembling. She pulled it around her shoulders. It was warm, expensive, the kind of fabric that whispered of wealth and status, and things that were normally far beyond her reach. The coat was tailored, fitted, the kind of garment that suggested care and attention and resources. The kind of coat that a person who was invisible could never afford. "I watched the footage," Kangdae said. His voice was different now. Not soft and controlled in the way it had been before. Broken somehow. Like a man whose understanding of the world had shattered, and was in the process of being rebuilt. Frame by frame. The bullet hit the stroller, where my son's head was resting. Martha said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence spoke clearly enough. The truth had revealed itself in the footage. The sniper round had impacted the chrome handle. Martha's push had moved the stroller away from the trajectory. The child had been saved not by Kangdae's guards or resources or power, but by a homeless woman who had seen something that no one else could see. "Your hands are shaking," Kangdae observed. "PTSD," Martha said. The word came out rough. Honest. Raw with the weight of years and trauma and survival. War zone. Kandahar. Combat médic. 7 years. Got discharged. Didn't transition well. For a moment, Kangdae stood in silence. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, like the space between two people who had been enemies and were now something else, something that neither of them had a word for yet. Then he turned and walked toward the door. You'll be taken to a private medical facility. The syndicate's facility. You'll receive treatment for your condition. You'll receive housing. You'll receive resources. Doctors. Therapists. Medication. Whatever you need. Martha stared at him. Why? Because the homeless lady did what my 7 elite guards couldn't, Kangdae said. His voice was steady now. Resolved. Carrying the weight of a man who had just learned something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the world. She saw something they missed. She acted when they couldn't. And because of that, my son is alive. He paused at the door. His hand rested on the frame. And for a moment, Martha could see something in his expression that she had not expected to see. Not gratitude. A man like Kangdae probably didn't know how to feel gratitude. But something close to it. The recognition that protection doesn't always come from the people you pay for it. That sometimes it comes from a ghost on a street corner with eyes that still remember how to read violence. That sometimes the most important things in life come from the most unexpected places. In a different world, Kangdae continued, I would hunt down the sniper myself. I would make them suffer in ways that would serve as a warning to anyone foolish enough to threaten my family again. I would extract the knowledge of who sent them and who they were connected to, and I would systematically dismantle every organization that had any connection to this attack. He looked back at Martha. And I will do those things. The sniper will be found. The syndicate will handle it. But Martha. It was the first time he had used her name. The first time he had treated her as a person rather than a problem. The first time he had acknowledged her existence in any way beyond her utility, as either a target or a tool. Your salvation has already been assured the moment you pushed a stroller out of the path of a bullet meant for a baby. In that moment, you stopped being invisible. In that moment, you became someone who mattered. And in this world, that kind of thing creates obligations. That kind of thing creates a debt that transcends normal considerations of power and status and consequence. The guards moved Martha out of the warehouse, through the underground passages of the syndicate's network, and into a black car that would take her to a medical facility where doctors would treat the trauma she had been carrying for so long. A facility where she would receive help transitioning from the streets. A facility where she would have a bed and food and the kind of stability that had seemed impossible just hours before, when she was sitting on a concrete crate, watching the world pass her by, waiting for a moment that would change everything. The last thing Martha saw, before the warehouse disappeared behind them, was Kangdae standing alone in the doorway with the metal chair still sitting empty, the zip ties cut into pieces on the concrete floor, like the remnants of chains that had been broken. In the business of power and violence, debts were the most dangerous currency. They created obligations that couldn't be ignored, relationships that transcended the normal hierarchies of money and status, connections that would bind two people together across the divisions of class and circumstance and background. A debt to a ghost who had saved your bloodline was a debt that would follow you forever. It would change the way you moved through the world. It would alter the way you understood power. It would force you to confront the possibility that protection sometimes came from unexpected places, that vision sometimes resided in people you had learned not to see, that the invisible sometimes possessed the clarity that the powerful had lost. Kangdae, the ruthless mafia boss who had built an empire on the understanding that the world bowed to his will, had learned something fundamental. He had learned that sometimes the most important things in life came from the most unexpected places. He had learned that a homeless woman could see what his elite guards could not. He had learned that sometimes when you removed all the illusions and all the pretense and all the layers of power and status, what remained was a simple truth. That life and death were not determined by the strength of your guards or the size of your organization, but by the willingness of strangers to act when action was required. Martha's salvation had been assured not because she was important or powerful or wealthy, but because she had chosen to be visible at the exact moment when visibility mattered more than invisibility. Because she had chosen to act when action was required. Because she had understood, with the clarity that only combat veterans possess, That sometimes the only thing worth doing is the thing that costs you everything. In the car on the way to the medical facility, Martha looked down at the expensive coat Kangdae had given her. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel cold.